The Grand Canyon is perhaps the most famous natural phenomenon anywhere in the world. And when there's so much hype surrounding a place like this, you wonder whether or not it'll live up to expectations. On our most recent road trip across Utah and Arizona, we had the opportunity to spend 5 days exploring the ins and outs of the Grand Canyon. The first of these was focused around the many overlooks from the South Rim. Most visitors who visit the Grand Canyon only see a handful of viewpoints and never actually venture into the canyon. We made this mistake when we first visited in spring 2021. And though I did think the canyon was beautiful, I was pretty underwhelmed by the limited number of things we got to do that day. From then on out, this became one of those bucket list places that I knew we had to revisit. And overall, that's what differentiated our second visit to our first, because on days 2 and 3, we made our way into the Grand Canyon for the first time. From the South Rim, we got to tackle the longest hike I'd ever been on, more than 15 miles down South Kaibab Trail and up Bright Angel Trail. This was an unforgettable experience and without a doubt one of the top 3 hikes I've ever done. Stay tuned because I can't wait to share it with you all. Days 3 to 5 was spent in Havasupai tribal land and was our first time ever camping. This is one of those bucket list experiences for any outdoorsy type of person, and though it requires a lot of advanced planning, I was so grateful we had the opportunity to do it. In the next video, I plan on diving into the details of what Havasupai is like, any tips that can maybe enhance your experience, and what our itinerary looked like. This video will remain strictly within the national park and contains the first 2 days that we spent exploring the Grand Canyon. Already, it may surprise some people to hear that the entirety of the Grand Canyon isn't a national park. The majority is, and certainly the most spectacular parts of the canyon itself are, but there are still some amazing places outside of park boundaries. In addition to the Havasupai Reservation, you may be familiar with the fact that we visited Grand Canyon West in 2022, which resides in the Hualapai Indian Reservation. There's also a handful of national monuments and other protected land encapsulating parts of the canyon and adjacent rim. The national park is by far the most visited section though, and due to its accessibility and grandeur, I think there's a good reason for that. The Grand Canyon was established as a national park in 1919 by President Woodrow Wilson, but prior to this became a national monument in 1908. This was done by President Theodore Roosevelt, who I'd say had by far the most involvement in the protection of the canyon. He was quoted by saying, "In the Grand Canyon, Arizona has a natural wonder which is in kind absolutely unparalleled throughout the rest of the world." And personally, I couldn't agree more. I've had the opportunity to visit many incredible canyons at this point, and none can even remotely compare to the sheer scale and impressiveness of the Grand Canyon. So let's get started with our first day spent in the South Rim of Grand Canyon National Park. As I said, I wanted our first impressions to be overlooks as I knew it'd be important to attempt to grasp the canyon before hiking into it. The first thing we noticed was how surprisingly forested it was at the South Rim. It's a stark contrast to other parts of the Grand Canyon like the start of Havasupai and Grand Canyon West. This makes sense though, as the land surrounding the South Rim is under the Kaibab National Forest. I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but I do just want to mention that in the nearby town of Williams, which sits within the National Forest, there is a really cool mountain coaster that we got to ride called the Canyon Coaster. It's the only mountain coaster in Arizona and provides really nice views of the forestry. But back to the Grand Canyon, our first destination would be Yavapai Point and a small segment of the Rim Trail. This is one of the most visited overlooks in the park as there's a pretty sizable parking lot nearby. It's absolutely breathtaking as any view of the Grand Canyon tends to be. And I absolutely loved walking along the rim with all the trees around you and the occasional opening that provides more spectacular scenery. We went half a mile on the trail to the most popular viewpoint of the canyon, and that's Mather Point. I was very impressed by how all the different observation points were designed, as you feel so exposed and it's typically quite roomy too. This was a great first stop, but up next is an overlook that I feel is pretty underrated and is brought to you by my stepfather Hugh. I would have had no idea about this one if it weren't for him, and it seems that not a lot of other people did either, because it was very quiet when we visited. Shoshone Point can be accessed by a flat 1-mile hike through the forestry, which is already pleasant in of itself. Something really cool we got to see was a tarantula along the trail, which I don't think I'd ever seen in the wild before. At the end of the trail, you walk along a ridge for a little while, and the tail end of it is where you'll be able to relax and take in Shoshone Point. There's no railings at this one, so it definitely feels the most exposed and natural. Plus, it's a true panoramic view, one of the most expansive in the park for sure. Don't pass up a visit to Shoshone Point if you're visiting the South Rim, because it is incredible. From here, we had the opportunity to drive east or west, and since we went west in 2021, we decided to go east this time around. Something to note about the easternmost overlooks is you are required to take a shuttle across Hermit Road. This is operational from the beginning of March to the end of November. I believe if you visit outside of those times, you can drive your own vehicle. The shuttle runs from about 5 a.m. until 1 hour after sunset each day, and we were out and about basically until the sun went down. We didn't stop at every single overlook, but instead did the ones I had heard were the best. First was Powell Point, which is great because it's also a very short walk from the next overlook known as Hopi Point. I did like Powell Point most between the two though, as it once again felt very expansive. I also like how much room you have to move around and can walk to more exposed areas without railings. Hopi Point was also great, with a cool trail working its way around the rim. The views were extremely similar though. Next up was Mojave Point, which is particularly noteworthy as it's the first time we got a clear view of the Colorado River from any of these overlooks. For those of you that don't know, the Colorado River is the driving force as to why the Grand Canyon exists, as it's carved all of its layers over time. It's really hard to comprehend how that could even be possible, but it happened over a period of 5 to 6 million years. This might have been my favorite overlook on Hermit Road, and if you've paid close attention, it's also what I used for the thumbnail of this video. The last viewpoint we stopped at was Pima Point, another outstanding look at the canyon and the Colorado River. It feels very similar to Mojave Point, but you can't go wrong with either. Every second I spent taking in the Grand Canyon was completely worth it to me. But the more we saw, the more eager I was to see the interior of the canyon, which is what we set off to do on day 2. I mentioned our trajectory earlier, but just to refresh, the goal was to hike down the South Kaibab Trail and up Bright Angel Trail. Experiencing each of the park's most trafficked hiking trails provides us with more perspectives, plus I've heard going up South Kaibab is a little too brutal on the legs. Not to mention, Bright Angel Trail features a handful of water refill stations, which I found to be incredibly useful on the way up. We made the mistake of not bringing nearly enough water and ended up using these right when we would have needed them the most. Our entire journey was 15 miles with nearly 5,000 feet of elevation gain. Obviously, going downhill isn't exhausting at all, but uphill is certainly very difficult. Combine that with the sheer length of this hike, and that's what made it one of the most challenging hikes I'd ever been on. It's either this or the subway hike at Zion for first place, each of which are difficult for different reasons. Our end goal was to make it down to the Colorado River and back, but a lot of people extend their hike an extra mile to get to Phantom Ranch, which is where there's a small lodge and area to buy food and drinks. We didn't have any reservations for any of those things, not to mention it's probably very expensive, so we vouched to pass it up during our hike. As far as what you'll need to bring, way more water than you think you'll need, and a meal plus some snacks per person should do the trick. Also, it's important that you start very early, especially if it's a shorter day in the autumn or winter. It personally took us 7.5 hours, but understand that we're pretty fast hikers and the average is closer to 9 hours. But this worked out perfect for us since we ended up finishing about an hour before sunset. Upon entering the park early in the morning, we were greeted by multiple herds of elk, and right then and there I knew it was going to be a good day. We parked near the trailhead for Bright Angel, which was our end point. We then took the Hikers Express shuttle bus, which left by the hour from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. We were on the 8 a.m. bus, which took us straight to the South Kaibab trailhead. Right away, I just want to say that the South Kaibab portion of the hike was by far my favorite. At every corner was a different view, and I think it does a brilliant job building anticipation as you head further and further inside the canyon. I always wondered how necessary it would be to see the Grand Canyon from the inside, and now I understand that it's 100% the most necessary thing to do in the entire park. It's the only way you can truly understand the sheer scale of it all. You start up high, so you're already getting pretty similar views to the South Rim overlooks. But there's a few points of interest pretty early on, like Ooh-Ah Point, where we had such crazy weather. It was very windy, a little drizzly, and we even got a handful of rainbows, which was amazing. My brother and I have always said that whenever there's a rainbow in a national park, it's got deer. And it's hilarious how accurate that's been because Yellowstone has Grand Prismatic Spring, Glacier has its colorful rocks and its lakes, Yosemite had small rainbows in the mist from its waterfalls, and now we have this, and I don't know how often weather like this shows up in the Grand Canyon. The next part of the hike that I really loved was Cedar Ridge, with similarly intense weather, but you're also on this narrow ridge with jaw-dropping views on either end. If I'm being honest, the whole trail down at the bottom was a focal point to me. I never got tired of the scenery even a little bit. If I had to pick a favorite view from the hike though, it might have been the area right after the tip-off, which is where you have two trails connect. You get your first up-close view of the Colorado River with its impeccable green color. Not to mention, it's a peek inside Bright Angel Gorge, which when you think about it, is a canyon within a canyon, and there's a lot more where that came from in the Grand Canyon, which is what makes this hike so spectacular. There's 2 suspension bridges that cross the Colorado River, with my favorite being the Black Bridge. This looks absolutely breathtaking and complements the area beautifully. Plus, standing atop it was thrilling and rewardingly marked the bottom of the canyon for us. The other bridge is the much older Bright Angel Bridge. This is what connects the South Kaibab Trail to the Bright Angel Trail, and in my opinion, this one is quite a bit more sketchy. Obviously, neither of them are even remotely dangerous, but the movement of it still freaked me out a little bit. Upon starting up the Bright Angel Trail, it didn't take long to notice that this was the much more mature route. Part of the reason I say this is its length, but also there's a handful of creek crossings you'll have to do, which I wasn't expecting. It was never a problem for us since we had waterproof hiking boots, but I can see this being a little bit difficult to work around if you don't. You follow this creek for the first bit of this trail, and all the vegetation that's grown around it is stunning. It was one of the defining characteristics of the Bright Angel Trail that differentiated it. I will say the array of views you get on this route is not nearly as diverse, but the views you do get are still equally as impressive. The The last 4.5 miles of this hike was really tough for me and by far the steepest section of the trail. Just when you think you've about made it, it's revealed you still have another few miles to go. It definitely felt never ending to me, but when we finally made it to the South Rim again, I felt more accomplished than I maybe ever have after completing a hike. In part because of how treacherous it was, yes, but also because I got to see things that I'll never forget in my entire life. This immediately became one of my favorite hikes I'd ever done in a national park, and just in general. I can't recommend it enough if you're up for a challenge, and I can't imagine anyone would regret it. Now, there's still plenty of footage left over from the hike that I don't want to let go to waste, so for the next few minutes, enjoy a slow compilation of some of my favorite shots from this one-of-a-kind hike in Grand Canyon National Park. We finally made it back 7.5 hours, which is actually really good from what I understand. That was definitely the longest hike I've ever done, and one of, if not the most difficult, but the views were absolutely incredible. Definitely one of my favorite hikes I've ever been on. As you can clearly see, the Grand Canyon is truly a place unlike anywhere else in the world. After my first visit, it never ranked particularly high for me, but now, after everything we experienced, it's easily a top 3 national park I've been to. And I think when you factor in everything we saw in Havasupai, you could make the argument for it being number 1. I know Havasupai isn't technically part of the national park, but it's by all means the Grand Canyon, and frankly, I can rank things how I want because this is my channel. But if it weren't obvious enough, I'd absolutely recommend visiting the Grand Canyon, and especially one of its inner canyon hikes. That was truly one of the best experiences of my entire life. Let me know in the comments if you've been to Grand Canyon National Park, what you thought of it, and what your experience was like. Also, be sure to give this video a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe to Travel Dash so you don't miss any content like this in the future. Until next time, I'll see you all very soon. Bye guys.